Check, does it work? All right, so we're gonna start now. Thanks everyone for showing up. Thanks for joining us online. I'm Jay, hi. So this is a talk that I gave when I was still lecturing at the university, and it's kind of starts with the basics, like color theory and everything, and goes more into detail. Gonna go into the content for today. Gonna talk about color spaces, coloring contexts, color schemes. So basically just basic knowledge you should have for creating any kind of visual stuff in digital media. We'll talk about shapes and form language. Maybe there will be some shaming too. Visual hierarchy, that's important for like setting up your project individually. Some animation principles that are useful for creating VFX, physicality, so how do you make stuff behave in a way that seems believable. Production, so yeah, just some little things I learned over the years of how to make it easier for your team to work with your stuff, and how to improve. And in the very end there will be time for questions, so if you have something you want to know and you might forget, let's just write it down because it's gonna be a while. I'll try to hurry through it, but yeah. Alright, so too much. Color spaces. So this is like an approximation of what the human eye can perceive, like in relation to each other. And you see that it's mostly green and a bit more blue than all of the other stuff. So there's the theory behind this is that growing up in nature, there's a lot of green, and the sky is blue. So if you have the ability to discern more different greens, it's more likely that you survive and not get eaten by a predator. And you can use this in context to know that the RGB color space, which is mostly used for displays and digital screens, does not have this range. So you can kind of like tune that down and be aware of how to work with this. This is an example of a color space. This is CMYK, stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and T, that's black. That's mainly used for printing media. You've probably seen this if you've ever worked with print, like the different color variations that you get on those things. This is a subtractive color space, and that means that if you add colors together, they will always darken and eventually end up being black if you mix them all together. This color space is used for tangible colors, so anything that's not glowing, like if you mix actual paint that you would put on a wall, this is what you get, more or less. And as opposed to this, which is the RGB color space, that's what we mainly work with in digital media. The way this works, because it is an additive color space, is if you add colors together, they will always get brighter, and you eventually end up with white. So if you put them all together, like in the middle, you get a white result. There's also RGBA that adds alpha, so that's for transparency, but we'll get into that later. And usually you have 265 values for this, because it is a 24-bit color space. And like I said, there's also option to have a 32 color space, 32-bit color space. That's if transparency comes in, so you can like think of if this is a 0, let's say red would be 0. We'll get into that in the next slide. So red 0, green 255, blue 255, so both of them maximum would give you cyan. And the same way around, if you want to get yellow, you have red and green mixed together, like you saw before in the example with the color circles. If you would want to have white here, you just add 255 more of blue. If you want to have gray, you just take the median value of all of these, so it would be 128 for red, green, and blue. Coloring context. So this is very important for creating assets of any kind, really, because there's different effects of colors that you have psychologically, also physically. And as an example for like a physical context here, the red squares and the green squares are the exact same colors, but you probably, most of you will perceive them differently here. So on the left example, the far left red seems a bit colder than the one right next to it, even though it's the same color, and that's just because of the way that colors work when they are next to each other. And it's the same for the green example. So the green squares also are the exact same value, but you perceive them a bit differently, just because of the way that colors work. It's actually interesting. Is this the same for someone here in the room? This. Okay, so none of you are colorblind or have a red-green weakness. The right example shows you how you would perceive the rainbow example with a red-green weakness. This can be important if you want to create distinguishable color palettes also for people who have this. It's about 12% of human population have a red-green weakness. And knowing this, you can create assets a bit more consciously also for people who live with this condition. That's another example of context. If you have a project where your color palette or your art direction requires you to think a bit differently. So this is like the very early Simpsons designs. When they started the show, they wanted to visually stand out, and one way of doing this was to choose a color scheme that was more or less unique at the time, and that completely changes how you have to think about working on a project like this, how you create assets for it. Like I think in The Simpsons, tree barks are purple because that's their way of like having brown stuff. You can also see it on the TV in the corner. Yeah, the same goes for natural examples. So here on the left we have like a smoothie with fruits. It's green and looks healthy. On the right side you see the snake that probably looks a bit less healthy. But it always depends on context. So I would guess that most people would feel positive emotions towards the left image and more negative ones toward the right, but maybe you have someone who had a pet snake and who has a fruit allergy. So to them that might be the other way around. So it's always about context, and keeping that in mind can help you create better assets. Then there's also cultural contexts. If you would create assets for a game that's set in the 1930s, the color brown can have a very, very different meaning as opposed to more modern things. So the examples of the uniforms here, just a reminder to be aware of what is the context of your project and produce assets that fit that thing. This is a bit more esoteric example. This is about thinking about your target group and what people will associate with certain colors. This is a color scheme that I guess German soccer fans would immediately attribute to a very popular German soccer club, while someone who lives in the US and has no idea about that would absolutely not do that. But if they're into photography, they might associate these colors with the Nikon brand, because that's the colors that they have. So when you do create assets, make sure that you have an awareness of what your target group is and produce them for that target group, because it can change greatly depending on what that is. So for this example, I guess that most people would say poison is green. But then what is a nature healing spell? Probably also green. And this can establish problems. So if you establish color codes for your projects or for your assets, you want to make sure that you distinguish these things, because especially in like your typical fantasy game where you have something like nature healing spells and poison effects, you do not want to confuse the viewer or your player by having the same colors for something that's good and something that's bad. But there's a way to make this more distinguishable. If you have the opportunity in the beginning of your project, you can create color palettes for this, and just establish your own color scheme for your projects. So I kind of had this problem when I was working on the Underraid project, which is like a fantasy game where you have exactly these kind of spells, And I noticed at some point, oh shit, our healing is green and our poison is green. But since I was in charge of the VFX, I could just establish a color palette, and this is not the one I used, but I was going for purple for anything that's like poisonish and green for anything that's a beneficial effect. So to just separate this more clearly for people who play the game. There's also a few associations that people, or especially gamers, draw from colors. So for example, poison has no color, but most people get a color in mind when they think about poison. Acceleration, for example, doesn't have a color, but in most games, I could argue, the color yellow kind of relates to that. So there's different meanings for colors, and if you know those, you can produce assets that fit the purpose that you want them a bit better. And this also changes over time, so it's good to be aware of these contexts and kind of try to keep up to date, because within the course of, I don't know, a generation, these things can vary greatly. I think over the last few years it's become much more prevalent for games to have the purple for poison, because this is a problem that has come up more often. So yeah, keep an eye on that. Alright, next we're gonna talk about color schemes. Just so you get the basics of how to create harmonious effects working with different methods. First up, this is a distinction between like warm and cold colors. Kind of varies on the edges there, but generally this is how you could split them up. So if you talk about warm colors, it's more the orange, yellow and reddish tones, and cold colors are generally more into the direction of blue. Then you have saturation. On the right top you see the saturated version, and on the bottom left the desaturated version. Basically the more desaturated you have something, the more gray it becomes. And when you create visual effects, in my experience, it's best to not go all out on the saturation, because it typically looks kind of unnatural, or like kind of stings in the eye almost. I mean, it depends on your project, but I typically go to like, I don't know, 80 to 90% maximum of the saturation that you can have, just because it looks better. Then you have light and dark, basically adding more white to colors makes them lighter, adding more black makes them darker. Now we have some example of color schemes, different color schemes that you can use for creating anything really. For VFX, this I would say is the easiest. So monochromatic, maybe you have, I don't know, lightning that's just blue, maybe a bit light blue, maybe a bit darker blue mixed in, but that would be monochromatic. Just pick one color and have different variations of lightness, darkness or saturation in it. They're very easy to produce, but they also kind of lack depth that you can get with other ones. Then we have analogous color schemes. This is basically just neighboring colors on the color wheel. Makes it a bit more enticing than just the analogous one, and it's typically easy to create assets that work with these colors, because there's not too much you can do wrong. It's a few examples here of analogous visual effects in games. So you can see the dragon thingy, for example, the big picture. It's like light blue cyan, and then it goes to the green. And there's also the choice for taking a complementary color scheme. Complementary colors mean they are opposites in every aspect. So if you mix up complementary colors together, they will cancel each other out, turning in gray. And they have the greatest contrast of the color schemes that you could go for, but they are a bit tricky to work with. So here's an example of complementary done wrong. If you have complementary colors, you gotta be really careful to not have the same brightness and the same saturation right next to each other, so you can see the green leaves and the red shield thingies, because they compete for attention. If you have something that's very saturated and very bright, of the same value, let's say, in complementary colors, it's kind of, your eye doesn't really know where to go. That can be confusing. You can use complementary colors still. There's a better example here. When you carefully consider like the timing of an effect, of course, can make a difference because you can have one color in the beginning and another one in the end. But you can also work with values. So you see on that example here that in the very first image on the left, the purple part is a bit more toned down, it's a bit darker, the yellow is brighter and more saturated. And then over the course of the effect, the balance kind of changes. There's a bit of a better example here. This is not necessarily complementary colors, but it's a good example of what I'm talking about. So you see that in the beginning, when the projectile spawns, it's this bright green, and then when the thing hits, you have this moment where the purple outlines around the character that move around a bit, they are very saturated, but just after the green has disappeared. So if you time this carefully, you can work with complementary colors and make a very engaging effect, because it's just more vibrant and has more depth to it than some of the other options that you have. So this one is a big slide. I'm going to just put this up here. I'll upload the slides. You can read through this. The base idea is that you have certain psychological effects on people by colors. So, for example, red can invigorate the viewer, blue can calm them down. And there's a lot of, let's say, more esoterical connections that you can draw from colors, and knowing them can be helpful if you want to create effects that serve your purpose. Like I said, you can read through this later. And there's also a link to the Adobe Color Wheel that I like to use. I'm going to just try to put this up now. I don't know if this will work, but do we have the cursor there? So here you can choose, say, monochromatic. That's what I talked about earlier. Complementary color, and if you move these things here, you see that the whole, on the top right, the whole scheme changes, and you can play around with this. I found this very helpful when creating assets. There's a lot of options to go from. This is also going to be linked in the slides, so if you want to see that later, I got you covered. It's not the right one. Does it work? 11? There we go. All right. So next is form language. This is a bit more subjective. A bit less subjective than the colors. When you create assets for your game, you can use examples from real-life nature to create associations in the player that you want. For example, the staring eye is something that most people would find unsettling, just because of how we evolved as humans, and you don't want to be watched by that predator maybe, so most people will find this kind of unsettling, and knowing things like this you can use to your advantage to create, to evoke the emotion in the player that you want. What I typically like to do is, just like in character design, I go with extremes first to find the right direction, and then once that's done you can still tone it down when it's too much, but I feel like that way you come up with more interesting results than just going with the first idea you have and kind of keeping it too tame, so to say. And there's always the opportunity to make it less extreme later, but this has worked very well for me. And you also, like with the colors, it's a lot about context, so the way we perceive shapes depends greatly on what the environment is. And if you have a stronger or a more extreme environment, then you also have to accommodate for this when creating the assets. So in this example here, that's like a little mock-up thing I made a while back for a project. The idea was that you have either triangles with very sharp edges or rectangles, depending on if something is alive or not. And if you work in a project like this, you have to be really careful to still be able to use shapes that you would otherwise use to, for example, imply danger. Like in this example, the spikes, they work perfectly well for this because it's all rectangular, and then you have these red spikes that scream danger, danger, like you know exactly if you walk on this, you're gonna be in trouble. But that wouldn't work as well in this example because the leaves already have this shape, so you would have to find a way to still communicate the importance of something like spikes for this example. So yeah, like with colors, context is important for the shapes as well. And proportion matters as well, especially if you have something that is, I don't know, maybe you have a wizard spell that is supposed to be super powerful. If you make that just bigger, it will already have more impact. You also got to be careful of the relation to the other assets that you make, because if this big ass wizard explosion spell is the same size as your, I don't know, basic attack, it can take away from the big impact that the big thing would have. So you should always try to find a balance. What I usually do is I create a lineup of all the effects that I make and then put them next to each other and see how they relate to each other and what the impact is of one compared to the other, and you can still fine-tune that, and it's easier to do that if you have them all together. Yeah, so this is about creating sprites. If you do have stuff that is, like, especially for a project that's more stylized, I've seen a lot of times that people want to go for like a photorealistic sprite, which in itself is beautiful, so the thing on the right doesn't look wrong, but if you go for a stylized thing, especially if you have effects that move, and the faster they move, the more important this is. You want to make sure that they have clear shapes, that they have, I don't know, at least a few sharp edges for the eye to distinguish what it is. And it's gonna be very difficult to read the photorealistic stuff if it moves, and especially if it's in a project that's very stylized, I don't know, very cartoony. You want to have an eye on this, and yeah, try to avoid noise, which is another example. So I have a lot of League of Legends references in here because there's, if you look through the time, it's an interesting development that you can see, and I can also see what went bad, what went good. So yeah, this is one of them. In the very beginning, you had this projectile from a character that's way too much noise, especially considering this is something that moves very fast, and this was changed pretty early on, as far as I remember. Because if you add a lot of noise to a moving object, it's really almost painful to look at, and it's hard for the eye to really distinguish the shape of moving stuff when there's a lot of noise in it.
Okay.
So
can I ask a question?
would be best if you can keep that for the end, if that's okay.
Okay.
Unless it's something really
I will
quick.
forget it, it's fine.
You can write it down, or yeah, you
Doesn't
can just
matter.
ask now and I can remind you
Doesn't
later.
matter, I look it up.
Okay. So yeah, if you have a projectile, this is another example of like how to tune it down, basically boil it down to something that works better when it's moving. The right effect would probably be good if it's just like, I don't know, you have a static flamethrower or something, that would work. But if this is a thing that's supposed to move, then yeah, it's again too noisy. There's not really a good way to distinguish where the thing is on the screen, so you want to turn it down and not confuse your viewer too much. That's another example for projectiles. It's also something that you can see in the very early League of Legends stage. They had a lot of projectiles where it's just like, let's say, one orb followed by several others that get smaller. The problem with this thing is that, again, it kind of creates more visual noise, because every frame that you have, these things would just jump more or less. You can't really discern where is this coming from, where is this going. So when you do create a projectile, it's best to give it some kind of trail that you can see, okay, this is where it comes from, this is where it goes. And I don't know, adding a motion blur probably helps as well. Because it feels like you have a frame rate drop if you, I mean, you can test this yourself in whatever engine you work in. Just take a static thing like this round star shape and move it from A to B, and then underneath put in something that is a bit more stretched out, that has a trail, maybe some particles that stay behind, it will always feel like it's more smooth just because the eye has an easier time following it. And yeah, you don't necessarily need to do the trail thing on a continuous gradient like the blue example. You can also do this with static meshes, like the rocks being thrown on the bottom. You still have this effect of having a trail because there's a very high contrast in the tip of the effect. So the first stone is bigger and stretched, but you can see that the further down it goes, it gets darker, and you kind of have a gradient between the rocks. So if you do need an effect where it's like stones, you can't really make a gradient of stones, but you can still create this trail effect just by the way that you color the things and the values that you use. And yeah, that generally works pretty well. Personally, I prefer to just slap a gradient on anyway, just because it looks nicer, but maybe your art direction doesn't go with it. Alright, so this is an example from industry design where you distinguish shapes by their surface quality. So it goes from positional, tangent, curvature. It's like just different ways of describing the surface of something. And knowing these things can also help you with creating visual effects, especially if it's something that you want to look more natural, because the tangent thing, as far as I know, it doesn't really exist in nature. Maybe there's some edge cases, but usually it's either positional or curvature. There's some examples for this. And tangent will always, or in most cases, look like it's man-made. So if you have something that's very mechanical, or something that's, I don't know, industry design, something that a human thought of, designed and created, it's usually the connotation that you get with this. And the trap that I feel like people fall into a lot of times is to have this shape, the tangent shape, that is an unnatural one, even though they want to create something that looks natural. And this is because usually the tools that we have kind of fall into that category. So if you're mindful of this, you can remind yourself, hey, this is something that wouldn't happen in nature. I kind of have to adjust this to make it work for something that looks a bit more natural. So in this example, from the left to the right, you have the tangent shape, shaped by the whatever Photoshop brush, for example, you have. Then of course it looks like this, and the more you abstract it and kind of stretch it and make it organic, the better the result will be if it's something that's supposed to not look like it's part of a robot or whatever. Next is visual hierarchy. So this is probably something that you should have established by someone in the project at some point. So it's kind of part of art direction, I guess. The point here is that you want to steer the player's attention, and if you create VFX, most of the times they are kind of related to gameplay. Not always, but you need to be mindful that this is a thing to keep an eye on, because if you create effects that do not fit the visual hierarchy that you have established, then that can be a problem. So what does this mean generally? If you, let's say you have a game where the visual effects are on the very, very highest importance of your project, maybe, I don't know, it's a project about placing fireballs in certain directions and, you know, making sure that the spells that you have are #1 focus in the game. How do you achieve that? You want them to have a high value range. So in this example here, the character would actually be the focus along with the VFX, but more of the character, because positioning is important here. You want to have a strong contrast. So you can see in the character, like there's very dark and very high light colors. You want to have a clear silhouette. That's a bit less apparent because this character is moving, so a screenshot is not the best way, but you can see the very clear silhouette in the arrow that's being shot. You can definitely see where the tip is. You see how wide it is. You see the direction that it's going to. High opacity. So if you have effects that are almost completely transparent, it's gonna be difficult for the player to see them. And intense movement. So yeah, again, still picture. This isn't a GIF, so we don't have movement here, but believe me, this arrow flies fast and the character moves around a lot, and it's very, very hard to miss. And yeah, keep in mind that you should probably talk to the people, like game designers, or if it's a smaller team, whoever is in charge of making game design decisions. How important is this? Do we want the VFX to be on the top? Do we want the VFX to be on the complete bottom? Because that's also an option. And then, yeah, make sure that your visual hierarchy is right for this. If you do want your effects to pop more, but you can't make it brighter, an easy way to achieve this is to just add like a back shadow to it. So if you have a very bright effect and you just need more contrast for whatever reason, yeah, just give it a dark backdrop. Just make sure that it doesn't make the effect darker. So you kind of have to be careful with what shader you're using, but yeah, it's getting too much into technical stuff now. When you do this, you do want to be careful to not compete with other aspects of the game that might be more important. So if you have a game that relies heavily on UI with a high contrast, you might want to be careful doing this too much, because if the UI is black and white, let's say, and you have this effect that is black and white as well, could be becoming a problem. Like again, back to the previous slide, visual hierarchy, you want to make sure that it's in the right spot. Another very important thing is to add secondary elements to your effects too. So to not just have the part of the effect that is gameplay relevant, but also by giving some flavor or some extra element that makes it feel like it's actually something that belongs into this world. A part of this is, if you have a projectile and it hits, don't just turn everything off, because suddenly you have a trail that's disappearing. Maybe you have an effect that, I don't know, is an explosion. If you just make a big flash for a fraction of a second and nothing else happens, it looks kind of weird. So you want to have a secondary effect like smoke or sparks flying or anything really, just to add to what it is. And the important thing about this is to keep in mind what is gameplay relevant and what isn't. For the gameplay relevant parts, you do want to have, again, higher contrast. Make sure that it fits into your visual hierarchy. And for the secondary effects, because they're not focus points, they're just there to kind of make this thing feel more lively, you can tune it down a bit. Can add effects with lower values, less contrast or less opacity. Generally, it's also good to have something that moves a bit slower. So with the explosion example, there could be like a big outburst that goes really quick, and then after that just a few sparks that fly out a bit slower, or smoke that goes up slowly and then fades away. And in my experience, it always feels better if these secondary effects that are marked green here just stay a bit longer, even if the original effect that you had is already gone. So you can kind of tier that and construct a bit more engaging and believable thing out of different elements. Yeah, this is another example of the visual hierarchy. It's a snapshot from League of Legends once more. This is a good way to show the impact that you can have with just creating effects that have more contrasts, more visual range. So in the right side you can see compared the environment fire that's in the background. It's not gameplay relevant, and on the right side you see the color range of the spell effect that is, because it's gameplay relevant, pops more. And if you look at that thing, the background fire doesn't look wrong. It fits within the environment, and if you see the colors right next to each other, you would probably, like, if you just take the right example, the far right with the two color things next to each other, it would probably instinctively feel like the background, the environment fire is too dull and not bright enough, but it does work within its context because that's the visual hierarchy of that game. So the environment is a bit toned down because the focus is supposed to be on the spells and the characters. Yeah, this goes kind of back again to the size matters thing. You should be able to communicate visual effects importance to a player, and you can do that by making it more impactful or sizing it up. So if a basic attack effect would have the same importance as a very rare and mighty spell, it takes away from the mighty spell, and it also probably confuses the player because it looks like it has a big impact, but then it doesn't. So this is also important to know and talk to your team and whoever's in charge of, like if it's not yourself, if there's other people making the game design, for example, you should know, oh, this effect is like a very small one because the gameplay that it's tied to is not as important as like this big ultimate thing that's gonna change your game forever, who knows. And you should always create effects with that in mind so that you can communicate what the actual gameplay mechanic is. Alright, we'll talk a bit about animation next. I'm not covering all the animation principles for this because they are not all that relevant for VFX, but I found some of those, like this is from character animation, I found some of those to be very helpful for creating visual effects as well. There's a wealth of different sources for learning how to animate, and they usually go into the animation principles as well, so if you're interested in that, I highly recommend it. If you want to create VFX, it's definitely a good thing to know. Yeah. So the first principle here, that's squash and stretch. You can emphasize movement if you stretch stuff in a certain direction that it moves in, and in most cases it will feel also like it's more tangible, more believable, especially if it's something, I don't know, maybe you're shooting a goo ball somewhere. That's something that will move a lot when it's in motion. When I do this, I typically try to maintain the volume of an object, so if I stretch it, it gets longer, but it also gets thinner. Same if you squash it. I feel like, yeah, this looks a bit more believable. There's examples where you don't need this, but yeah, it's a good rule of thumb, I guess. Next principle, that's anticipation. So the idea of this is that if you have a big movement, let's say you have an explosion, what I like to do with VFX, let's say there's some sparks or some energy going into the middle first, and then a big explosion comes outward. Or if you have something that moves, like if I would move my arm, you go back first, and then you hit to the front. And if you do this, the main movement, in this case the arm going to the front, will just be more exaggerated. So if you feel like you have an effect that should have a lot of impact, it always helps to have a reverse movement first and then go out for the explosion, for example. And you can use this for all kinds of things. It doesn't have to be like a circular thing or like the arm example. I guess the ball is a more abstract example of this, but it generally helps. You just have to think of what is the main movement that's happening, and taking the opposite of this first will just accelerate this a lot. Yeah, this one is easing. So this means basically if you like see movement as a curve over time, if you as a line over time, if you use curves, things will look more organic because it's just how physics work, I guess. Most movement is determined by things speeding up first and then slowing down. So you never have this moment where something shoots off instantly with a certain speed. There's friction and everything, so you usually gradually come towards the maximum speed and then slow down again. And that's the same for using, I don't know, sparks flying away, having an explosion as well. It goes fast first and then slower. Usually it looks better. And you can also use this for the size or the opacity of your effects. So if you have something that in the beginning fades in, then stays at maximum opacity for a while and then slowly fades out again, it usually looks better than just, I don't know, having a thing plop into existence and then disappear again. Feels very unnatural. You can use this to your advantage if you want to create something that's very mechanic. That's the example on the right side. That would be like very mechanical movement, because it does not have this speeding up and slowing down thing. That's, I would say, generally more organic feel. But even there, you could use easing for the beginning and the end. So when the thing reaches its peak, it kind of wobbles like this. You see it on the left now, and then going back on the right, it's like this movement, and this wobbling, that is something that is affected by physics. So you can use the curve for this movement, while the rest of it is a very straight line. This is about secondary movement or overlapping action. What this means basically is that if you have a entity, whatever, a body that is moving and something is attached to it, there's always one element that is the leading part and one element is the following part. So in this example, the cube is leading. Let's imagine that the ball is chained to the cube. This would be an example of doing the secondary movement. What's important about this is that the following motion usually takes longer to come to a halt than the leading motion, just because it is influenced by it and then usually, wobbles around for a bit. And when you do this, or when you animate in general or do VFX, you should be mindful of what is the origin of movement in this thing, what creates the force, and then create the asset accordingly, because it can feel really, really weird really fast if you do have several entities that are somehow linked together and they do not behave in the way that you would expect them to. Another thing, for character animation, typically principle of animating in arcs means that because of our anatomy, a character would never walk like in a perfectly straight line. I mean, you can kind of do this, but it's unnatural. It's just because our limbs work with rotation, and you have this moment of, if you take a line of a character moving, it will be kind of like a waveform. And you can also apply this knowledge to creating visual effects. It's a bit of a different thing for most VFX, I would guess, but very few things in nature move in a perfectly straight line. There's always some kind of arc or rotation involved, and I found that using this for creating VFX makes it a bit more tangible, a bit more believable. It typically looks better. A really easy way to achieve this is to just spin the things a bit. Like if you have an example of, I don't know, a projectile that would go from A to B, you can just create an arc that goes like this, or you can rotate the object itself just so it's not perfectly straight. In most cases it will look better, unless it's something that's really, I don't know, otherworldly or maybe very mechanical. If you use Unity, I don't really know too much about how other engines handle this, but a really easy way in Unity, if you use particles, for example, there's a noise component and you can just turn on, and that will add some sway or rotation, or instead of having something go a straight line, it would like wobble around a bit just because it's dragged away by the wind a bit. So that's an easy way of doing that. That's a big one, timing. So if you have effects that are very fast and impactful, timing is really important. I'll show an extra example here. So this is the same effect, and you probably don't notice this in just the left example, but there is one frame of complete darkness. There's one frame of this crescent shape that you can see. You don't really consciously see this, the crescent shape, for example, but it does add a lot to the impact of the effect, because even one frame of complete darkness or one frame of a very bright thing that's also here can add a lot to the effect. And I found that a lot of times when people create effects and they try to get into it, they're not that experienced yet, they do create beautiful sprites that work really well, like the crescent shape thing, for example, but then they have this notion of, oh, I made this sprite, so it needs to be visible, so they leave it on screen for half a second. But then the problem with that is that the impact of the whole sequence is not given anymore. So you want to be mindful of this. It feels kind of wrong. It took me a while as well to get this, but if you create an effect that should have a big impact. A lot of times it's really enough to just have parts of it be visible for one frame. It's kind of the same for animating characters. I also noticed this with myself in the beginning. All the animations I did were very slow, and it kind of looks like your character is underwater. What I like to do, because it's just something that happens when you animate stuff, I take a sequence or VFX or character animation or whatever. In the end, when it is done, I cut it down to, or like squash it down to half the length it was before, and then I don't look at it for a while, like, I don't know, maybe half an hour. Just reset your eyes somehow and go back to it, and then look at the squashed down version of it, and yeah, you will notice if this feels right or not. Maybe it's too fast, but in most cases I feel like then it's the right thing. Because even after all those years, I do this myself. It's way too long, it's way too slow. Squash it down, give it a rest, go do something else or work on something else, come back and look at it, and in most cases it will just look much better. And don't worry, if you made this sprite, it's just visible for one frame, that's perfectly fine, because it does have the impact that you want it to. Maybe it's not something that everyone notices, but if the effect works, I guess your goal is achieved. So yeah. Next up is physicality. So this is a tangent of make things obey the laws of physics, unless your project is something very outlandish where this should not apply. But generally speaking, I would say in our line of work, we don't really have laws of physics. We kind of approximate them or fake them. And if a player perceives something like, I don't know, visual effects that are related to something that you would get in real life and it doesn't behave right, they will know immediately. It's something that you grow up with, you see it every day, so you want to try to keep this in mind and produce assets as best as you can according to the laws of physics. So if you have an effect and it's done, what I like to do is just remind myself, hey, if this thing, even if it's like some crazy made up magic spell, obviously you do not have this in real life, but I think if I would have this in real life, would it behave the way that it does on the screen now? And if it doesn't, then change it. It just adds to making your world feel more believable. And a lot of times, if you don't have this in mind, you can create stuff that looks really off or kind of weird, and it's hard to grasp maybe what exactly the problem is, and most times it comes down to this. That being said, there's plenty of opportunity to add unrealistic stuff, like stylized effects for a very stylized game. You would probably have something like this, where there's speed lines indicating you how fast you are, even though this is not at all something you would see in real life. It's kind of getting a balance and an understanding of where should you apply these things and where shouldn't you. I guess you probably have seen enough examples of, I don't know, cartoons or whatever. Sometimes things that are unrealistic can just add to the impact of something, like the speed lines here or the wide impact thing. It's a bit more comic-y, so it works, even though it's not something you would have in real life. But again, even there, make it move like it was real. You don't necessarily need to always move stuff right if you fake it right, so to say. So you can indicate directions of effects with sweeping particles, for example, even if you have, like in this example, the static mesh. There's this ice thing on the ground that kind of just spawns up from the ground, basically just pops in. But the particles that are added to this effect give it sense of direction. So it looks like, okay, this is a cold wave that comes from the character to the front just because of the sweeping particles, even though the actual mesh is just a static thing that doesn't move. So it can kind of use motion here combined with a static thing to still convey the emotion that you want to convey. Because this was a spell for a game that was supposed to knock back an enemy, so we needed to make sure that it looks like it goes from here to there. And there again, like this is a good example for the secondary effects that I talked about earlier. In the end, you can still see some clouds moving away and some like little glitter things. They're not necessary for the effect themselves, like the gameplay part of it, but they just add to this whole feeling of this feels like a cold cloud of wind or whatever. And I also like to encourage people to use secondary motion as often as possible. It will just make your effects more lively and believable. And it's always good to, there again, keep in mind how would this behave if it was real, like the glittery green stuff you can see, or the little stars when they fly around. They don't just shoot off in straight lines, they kind of swirl around like in this green vortex. The way it moves there, it would drag them down with it a bit. Or the stars on the right side, they just wildly shoot out a bit because there was a very impactful effect that really pushes them along. So if you do secondary effects, which you always should, or let's say in most cases, try to make them adhere to whatever the let's say set of physics in this effect would be. Now we go a bit into production. There's not too much here, but it's an example of distinguishing what your effect actually is before doing it. So before creating an effect, you should think about, is this a symbolic or a practical effect? Symbolic effects usually convey more abstract game ideas or game mechanics through symbols or well-known visually established things like, I don't know, the stars over your head. Everyone will understand what that means. Most status condition effects in games, for example, are symbolic because they are not, you would not see them if you were a character in this world, but it's there to convey a gameplay feature or some kind of gameplay element. And opposed to that, you have practical effects. Like I said, they are not gameplay relevant, but they are needed for consistency in a game. Like if you have a fireball shooting somewhere, you kind of expect this thing to burn now. A torch should be burning unless it's turned off, right? So this is a practical effect. You can also have effects that are both. They are not mutually exclusive, but I feel like it's helpful to know before you create this, if this is something where you work more with symbols or more with like what in-game coherently makes sense. This is about getting it right, basically. It always helps to look for references. I guess especially when you're new to an area, there is a bias of assuming that you kind of know how things look like. But most of the times, looking at references, you will notice that maybe they don't work the way that I thought. It's just of the way that our brains work. Like you have to kind of generalize and trivialize more complex things to get along in the world and not go crazy. And that tricks us into thinking that we know what we do a lot of times, but we actually don't, kind of. So researching and looking for references will make your life much easier, and you can spare a lot of otherwise wasted time just by keeping this in mind and trying to find examples of what the stuff is that you want to go for and just analyzing it. If you can, it's really helpful to create concept art or to ask your concept artist to do it if you do VFX. You don't need to go all out on this, but it's a good way to just foresee possible issues with an effect that could be in-game before actually putting in the work of creating it. If you can, you should basically communicate with as many of your team members as you can about this without like taking up too much of their time. But if you have an animator, for example, if you create VFX, you will have to work together really closely if you have a game that has a lot of like character spells, something like League of Legends, where you have a lot of characters that have their own skills and abilities that are very tied together. You can talk to your animator, communicate possible moves or poses for character visual effects so that you can tie them together a bit more. Or better yet, learn basics of concepting and animating characters if it's like character VFX. Because I feel like creating visual effects is a very diverse discipline, and you will benefit greatly from just trying to get out of your comfort zone and looking at things and work areas that maybe you haven't considered too much. You don't have to be Da Vinci to create a scribble. Like, it's enough to just keep practicing, and even if you do it on a very basic level, it's better than not doing it at all. So you can just sit down and think about how would this character move, maybe make a scribble, and then try to, kind of come up with even if it's very crude, just a simple design of the spell that this character uses could look like this, and then you also have a basis to talk to your team about. It just makes things easier. This slide is about sound. I didn't find a picture for that, but the basic idea is that your visual effect doesn't always have to convey all the information alone, because there's other mediums to do that as well, like sound. And having different sounds for an effect can change the way that a player perceives it a lot. I remember we did have this problem once. We had some kind of character ability that was something that rotates. But the problem with this was we couldn't rotate the thing visually fast enough, because it was a projectile, so it goes from A to B, and there was a lot of movement, so we had to do it like really slow. But we still wanted to have this impact of this is something that rotates really fast, like maybe you have a boomerang or a bowler that's flying. So you can still do that with sound. So the visuals would be like this, but then you have a sound that goes kind of like and that really is much faster than what it actually moves, but it conveys the information to the player of, hey, this is something that rotates really fast. So this is a good example of work together with your sound designer. And if you have a good communication there, they will probably already ask you the meaning of this effect or like what it should sound like. But if you're in charge of creating the effects, it's always good to let your sound designer know as well, hey, this is something that, like in this example, is supposed to move really fast, so can you make like a much faster sound for it? And that, typically will result in just better result, because you convey the idea that you already had, and then someone else can work with that. Another thing for production is that, especially in bigger teams, it can happen pretty fast that a lot of people work in different departments. So this is an example from a League of Legends character. You have the splash art of the character, you have icons for the spells, you have the in-game model, you have the in-game VFX, and you want to make sure that this all is visually tied together, because it can be very daunting if you have a lot of different people working on different aspects of the same, let's say, asset, in this case the character, and they all have, I don't know, different art styles, different colors, whatnot. You really want to make sure to keep these things together. I guess that in most cases it's going to be rare to find people who do visual effects and take care of all the other art aspects as well. So you got to be aware of this and make sure that you communicate with your team properly, and just avoid making something that looks like 5 different people were working on it. You want to make it a coherent thing in the end. And this is about accepting feedback. If you have someone who maybe oversees your work and is like, you were supposed to make an ice bolt effect, but someone sees it on your screen and says, hey, this sugar cannon looks really cool. Don't be upset about it. It's natural to be upset, but you can use that feedback. So you can try to find out what led to that impression. Maybe talk to that person and ask them, hey, why do you think this is a sugar cannon? Because I wanted this to be an ice bolt. And then you have a conversation, and you can just improve or get rid of the aspects that were misleading. I guess it's not that much of an issue generally for most people, but just don't assume a mindset of, no, they just don't understand me and I'm right, because usually outside feedback, unless it's like really coming from people who are not related to the industry, outside feedback, I feel like in a place like this is usually more important and more valuable than the, let's say, emotional attachment to have you to your own work, because you're biased by having worked on it, and maybe you've worked on it for too long, so you it's difficult to get an outside perspective. So keep that in mind, and you can take that. If someone gives you this feedback, you can iterate on your effect and make sure that it conveys whatever you want it to convey. Maybe you can go back to the person and ask them, hey, does this still look like a sugar cannon now, or is it an ice bolt? And if they say it's an ice bolt, then great. You iterated, it became better. one-shots are really rare, I would say. So don't be upset if you have to iterate. It's just part of reality of being a game developer. All right, so this is almost it. It's just some things I've written down over the years to make production for you and your team easier. It's really nice to establish and stick to a folder structure if you have it. Your team will definitely thank you. It's going to be easier for you, especially working with VFX. There's so many different kinds of assets, and I don't know, you work on shaders, you work on animations, you work on 3D models probably, sprites if it's a 2D game. There's just a lot of different stuff that comes together. So having a proper folder structure really can save your ass there. You should probably have a naming convention. I mean, it depends on how big the project is, but if it's going on longer, adhere a naming convention. If you have no naming convention, you can champion for that and be the one who says, hey, if I do VFX for this, I will have to work with a lot of different things. Can we come up with a naming convention so that the rest of the team can stick to that as well? This is more a thing for Unity. I'm not too sure about other engines, but for Unity, make sure that the assets you create are not, so if you have a prefab, it can have a translation, x-axis 20 somewhere off. Maybe your programmer or game designer has to work with it. They drag the thing in and it's somewhere in the world, but not where it's supposed to be. So just make sure that you avoid this and to upload stuff that's clean and easy to use for the rest of your team. And then this is also really helpful. Time and estimation. If you can learn to estimate your production time, it will really help your team. This is something that needs a long time to kind of get a feeling for, but you can learn it. It's not a big deal if you start doing this and you're not perfect at it. Nobody is. But it's a really valuable skill for your team and also for yourself, because you want to be able to make a prediction of, hey, if I have to do this, it's going to take, I don't know, 2 days. Maybe you're done in 1 day, and that's perfectly cool. Maybe it's 3 days, that's also fine. The more you do this, the better you will become at it, and I feel like this is something that, is generally really helpful, no matter what you do, so try it. This is how to improve. You can learn to create your own textures and sprites. If you're interested in that, I would generally say everyone can do this to a degree. It will always be better if you have at least a basic understanding of those things. So basic 2D skills will be a huge help for creating visual effects. You can make your own sprite sheets. You can scribble out like different character interactions, for example. Again, back to what I said before, you do not have to be a super pro Da Vinci for making this. Just practice it, scribble and sketch on a regular basis, and it will really help you. Trying to get a feeling for the animation principles. I also mentioned this before. This is really helpful for visual effects because I can't really think of an instance where I created a visual effect that is not moving in some way. It's just something that you will encounter again and again. So the more you look into this, the better for your result. And you might even be able to do character animations because you dealt with this on a more regular basis. Generally speaking, I would say the more you leave your comfort zone, the better. For example, I'm not really a technical guy, but doing VFX, I got more and more into the tech art direction, and it has helped me immensely because now I can, I don't know, create my own shaders, which is really cool for making VFX. And I probably wouldn't have done that if I hadn't started like looking into this. So you will never be perfect coming into this, but that's fine, like I said before. If you just have a base level knowledge of something, that can already help you a lot. This is something that I like to do as well a lot, is to take video capture of existing game effects and analyze it frame by frame. So you saw this in the presentation earlier already, like I had a few examples of frame by frame examples of visual effects. You can look at what shapes are used in there, what colors are used, how are they like relating to each other, and what is the timing. I think that a lot of times if you look at these things you will be very surprised because there's some really crazy shit happening in a lot of like character animations or VFX that you don't even notice until you look through it really slow, and then once you've seen it it's like, oh yes, now I understand why this thing is so impactful or why this character behaves a certain way and I don't know, spawns this certain effect. So yeah, it's not only educational but can be really funny sometimes. Yeah, lastly, if you try to recreate more complex effects that you enjoy personally, it's a great way of getting a feeling for how to create your own ones from scratch. So if you're unsure, you can just look through, I don't know, there's 1,000 examples that you can look at, pick one, try to recreate that. You can do that a couple of times and you will probably get a much better feeling of how to do it yourself. So, to leave you with this quote, this is from Christina Wurm, was the, I don't know if she still is, but she was the Riot Games VFX lead when I first made this presentation a few years back. She basically said, research the fuck out of effects that inspire you. There's a wealth of video captures you can find online. Scrubbing through them frame by frame will help you understand what goes into an effect, how timing works, when, where, and what colors are used, and what kinds of shapes are hiding inside. So that's basically just another iteration of what I said before. The more you look into things, especially successful, visually successful things, the better you will get an understanding and be able to recreate them. All right, that's it for now. So now we got time for questions.
In the pixel part where you were explaining that clear sprites are better than realistic ones, what the heck was the realistic sprite supposed to be?
Do you mean the flame thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was just like an example of an explosion sprite. I can't really remember, it's been a while. But like it's a sprite sheet, so you go through frame by frame to create some kind of movement. Yeah. Do you remember your question from earlier?
Yes, I wanted to know what the term noise is regarding VFX. Because you said it multiple times and I was like,
Okay.
It was around 35 or something, the pages.
There we
yeah,
go.
this one.
Yeah, so the white on the left, that's basically like a noise map. So what it means visually is that you, opposed to, let's say you have a square like this, it's just one color, there's no noise in there because it's one perfect color. The more variation you have within this, the more noisy it becomes, like visually speaking. So,
And where can I see noise in that picture now? So
Like
with the
static,
It's like overlaid over the effect.
because a lot of small speckles.
yeah, it's not one consistent shape,
okay.
but it's like little dots everywhere.
So the noisy, the more lines there would be.
Yeah, I mean it can be lines, it
Or
can be dots
whatever.
like here, it can be anything really that is not like one consistent
Uniform.
shape or one consistent surface, let's say.
Okay.
Does
Just
that-
chaos.
It's chaos. Chaos is confusing for your
That's
eyes. So if you have fast moving stuff, don't do chaos.
Would you recommend any particular approach for just practicing kind of doing these kinds of things? Obviously you mentioned like looking at reference for existing things and frame by frame. Would you maybe just start by kind of like doing sketches and stuff like that with the kind of effect maybe frame by frame you're looking for? Or some people use 3D programs to generate practical effects, or not practical, visual effects, or like Illustrator, or is it just depend on your whatever you're using? Or I don't really know what I'm asking there. It's kind of like, I suppose, how's the easiest way of quick iteration of, I suppose, training yourself to just get comfortable with it.
For me personally, the way I got into it originally was I was just looking at particle systems in Unity. I come from a like more 2D art background, so I was doing action shots and concept art of characters before that. So I don't know how that would relate if you don't have that, but for me it was really helpful to just look at particle systems and play around with them. And you already have inherent movement there most of the times. So you can just play around with values and kind of find out how does this, I don't know, if I change this movement here, how does that affect how you perceive this thing. And then after having looked into that, I gradually moved on to, I don't know, 3D animations, for example, just having abstract animations of 3D shapes. Animation in general was really helpful with this. But yeah, I would say if I would have to choose an entry point, I would say particle systems probably, because you can do a lot with them. It doesn't need to be performant in the beginning. If you just want to figure out stuff, you can still like learn the technical kinks later. But I think it's a good way to get into it.
And by those particle systems, you mean like sometimes in 3D programs or 2D programs, for instance, you can have things like generating smoke or something, but you're replacing sprites and editing parameters for how long a life something has, or where it starts, how big it is, and how quick a decay is, and things like that, and that kind of thing. Experimenting with that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
You mentioned sprites and drawing like 2D stuff a few times, and I wondered like how much is it like drawing sprites against like setting up parameters for particle system, doing shaders, doing programming stuff, because like I did some of the stuff in Unity, but I mostly did like non-drawing stuff, like programming, shaders, particle systems.
Yeah,
I was wondering what is your like perspective, like how much is it of each?
Yeah, it kind of depends on where you feel that your strong suit lies. So for me, because I came from the 2D and art related background, it was really easy for me to create sprite sheets. You do not need to do that. Like for example, I don't know how to program. I mean, I can do a shader program if it's node based, but I can't script. That would be good to know for VFX. You do know how to do that, so you can use that to your advantage. I would say for me it's kind of rather equal distribution between everything, all of the disciplines that you named except for programming, because by now I have done all of these things already in some kind of way. But there's, especially with particle effects, there's a lot of different ways that you can achieve a similar result. So if you feel like you don't want to make your own sprite sheets, you can just create a shape through the particle system that is close enough to what the sprite sheet would do. Or you can, I don't know, play around with art packs maybe. You can buy some asset packs and take sheets or sprites that are already there and experiment with them. I would say if you have like at least a base knowledge of creating sprites, it is the most helpful for getting into it, but it's not strictly necessary, especially if you're good with, I don't know, creating custom shaders that can create very organic things. You probably don't even need sprites for that. For me personally, with my background, I wouldn't know how to do this without being able to make my own sprites, just because I lack the technical expertise on that part. But yeah, it really depends on what your preferences are, I would say.
Okay.
Someone else? Alright. Well then, I have the thank you
Thank you, Jay.
right here.
Thank you.
Do you want to take care of the stream end?
Yeah, sure.